going to be our keynote speaker today. She served on the district bench for the 4th Judicial District of North Carolina since 1999, and beginning this previous January, the Chief District Court Judge for Durham County. Judge Morey is an advocate for juveniles and is assigned to preside over the district's juvenile treatment court. Off the bench, Judge Morey volunteers at Gibbons, is that how you say it? School? Juvenile Court, and also with the Durham Teen Court. Judge Morey serves on the board of the Religious Commission for Nonviolent Durham and the advisory board for the Achievement Academy. Prior to becoming a judge in 1999, Judge Morey was the executive director of the Governor's Commission on Juvenile Crime. She has also been an Olympic swimmer and coach, journalist, assistant district attorney for the 4th Judicial District. Judge Morey received her undergraduate degree from Millikan University in Illinois, and she received her master's in teaching from Reed College and her Juris Doctorate from Western School of Law. I've had the opportunity to speak with Judge Morey at length about juvenile justice issues, and she explained to me that she became involved in juvenile justice while working as an ADA, and that traditionally ADAs in Durham begin in juvenile court and sort of as a stepping stone to bigger and better things like traffic court. And Judge Morey, however, when she was an ADA and working in the juvenile court, saw this as an opportunity to really impact the lives of young people. And instead of moving on to traffic court and so forth, she decided to stay working in juvenile court. And that was her initial entrance into this area. So I'm really excited to have you speaking to us, Judge Morey.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get you back on schedule because there's no way in the world I would ever speak for 50 minutes about anything. But I'm really honored to be here. And for those of you that came from out of town, I welcome you to Duke and to Durham and to North Carolina. I am out of my element. You all are scholars, published, Duke students of the law. I'm not. I just sit in a robe, rock back in a faux black leather chair, and listen to secondhand stories all day. Right now, I kind of feel like a wannabe getting into the Final Four the last 30 seconds, and I'm at Duke. You know, I'm out of my league. But I do want to say that I noticed by the brochure you've come from Pennsylvania, Delaware, Minnesota. Am I right? Tennessee? Is that right? Who'd I miss? Illinois? Massachusetts, the great Commonwealth. So for those that came out of state not to hear the keynote speech, I want to tell you I admire you. You've gone through TSA screeners. You've had virtual strip searches. And you have endured what most juveniles go through when we send them to detention centers. So you have a taste of it. And I need to add that I hope none of you brought any 16-year-olds with you when you came to this great state. Because if you did, you entered the unforgiving borders of North Carolina, which 16-year-olds are considered to be adults. Think of that, 16, 17-year-olds picked up in North Carolina, unlike 48 other states, for charges of possessing marijuana, misdemeanor assault, trespass, littering. In North Carolina, they are over at our jail, treated as adults. So, I had a case once of a 16-year-old who was cited walking into a high school for littering, throwing down a gum wrapper. An officer did a U-turn in the street, came up, wrote her a citation. He went to her court date, 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, waiting for her case to be called. He saw she wasn't there. He decided to take matters in his own hands, went to her house that night, waited 2 hours until she came home from a choir practice, put her in handcuffs, arrested her, took her down to the Durham County Jail, and the magistrate gave a $500 bond for failure to appear. So the collateral consequences of juvenile adjudications may be bad, but in North Carolina, it's worse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I am your keynote speaker. I had to write it out. I usually never look at anything, and I just babble. But once the word keynote came up, I thought, I have to prepare for this. But they searched. They searched far and wide to get the best keynote speaker they could possibly find. I live 1 mile that way. I work 1 mile that way. When I turn in my expenses, it may be between $1.45 and $2.35 for my half gallon of gas. So I hope you are going to soak up every word after this global search for your keynote speaker. You know, I am a judge now, and really it is. It is kind of like listening to stories every day. But they aren't stories. They are real kids with real lives. They are about anxious parents or absent parents. They're about angry cops. They're about impatient school officials, nervous, sad, upset victims, overworked court counselors, frustrated lawyers, standing room only courtrooms. And time again, there are a couple common refrains. I look out in our courtroom of juveniles, 95% are African American. Even though Durham, the population is about 50-50, the overrepresentation of minorities in our courtroom. And then I hear over and over again that judge, he was just a kid. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Let's be done with this. It's so much more complicated than that, as you all know, because juvenile court is a snapshot of our torn fabric of our class-based biased society. And as a presiding judge, it comes time for me to hear these cases. I am given a set of rules, what we call the law. I am instructed to apply elements of the crime to the offense. And the adjudication, that's the easiest part. The hard part is the disposition, because then that's when it becomes a novel. It's a history of these kids' lives, and more importantly, it's going to be about their futures. And 95% of the time, these are kids who at birth were 50 paces behind the starting line, through no fault of their own. And the heavy I live with, being the judge, is will my decision from the bench either encourage these youngsters who stand in front of me, or will my decision bury them with hopelessness so they never crawl out of the pit of delinquency or crime? More than 20 years ago, I started out, I was an idealistic prosecutor. I was assigned to juvenile court, and this is some of what you've already heard. We were assigned, you know, there's no press, there was no pressure. Juvenile court, juvie court, kiddie court, do well. Once you do well, graduate, traffic court, red lights, stop signs. Do well in traffic court on those DWIs, and then you're going to go up to district court, that third rung where you can try urinating in public cases, where you can try trespassing in public parks after dark. And then when you really are at the top of that prosecution level, the work of the state is seating the white jurors on black defendant cases arguing for death penalties. Well, as you can tell, I never made it up that far, thank goodness. Juvenile court stopped me. It stopped me cold in my tracks, because the stories I heard about the kids that came in for prosecutions, I couldn't begin to imagine the reality compared to my own upbringing. Transportation for them was not the car parked in the driveway, it's waiting for the city bus. Homework at night was not a book on the table, it was ducking gunfire. Food stamps, not money, brought in the mac and cheese. Thanksgiving wasn't a family turkey, but hanging on the street because the heat had been cut off in the house. And these are kids at 12, 13, 14. What choice did they have about the circumstance of their life? They had simply been born into it. And these are the kids I saw in my beginning years as a prosecutor. But then there came one crime. It was committed by a 13-year-old here in Durham, 3 miles from here. He changed the way everyone looked at juvenile crime in North Carolina. Greg broke into a 90-year-old woman's house. He had raked leaves with her before he decided he wanted her car. He broke into her house one early morning, demanded the car keys. She refused. He went out to the garden shed, got an axe. He hacked her to death, 57 stab wounds. It was the first time I had ever seen autopsy pictures of a victim on a table in the morgue. It was gruesome. Well, they picked him up a couple days after the murder, merely riding in the car that belonged to her. The police didn't have a great case at that time, and he and his mom were down at the police station. After a couple hours getting nowhere, they took his mom out of the confession room, interrogation room. He then gave a full confession out of the presence of the mother in violation of our state law. The press attended that trial every day, and the newspapers reported the events. They did not report his name, but they didn't have to. Everyone knew who it was. And this one case, when he was sent to a training school because our laws would not allow transfer to the adult system, the state legislature decided this horrible case should change the law for everyone 13 years old or over in North Carolina. So because of Greg's case, any 13-year-old who is charged not only with murder, any felony could now be transferred to the adult system. And 13-year-olds who are charged with murder or first-degree sex offense must be transferred to the adult system on a finding of probable cause. But it didn't stop there, because Greg's legacy lived on. Within months of release from training school, as required by law, and protests by law enforcement, how he could be back on the streets, he committed larcenies again. And finally, he went to a 7-Eleven, not far from here, with a gun in his hand, got all the money out of the cash. The attendant was standing there, scared to death, with his hand on the broomstick, and Greg decided he would put a bullet through his head too. He was taken to jail, and 4 days later, hung himself. And the story of Greg still was not over. Because that was the year our governor was running for his last term to be governor. And his mantle at that time was crime and justice. And in his brochure, he said, quote, "We are going to stop these punks and thugs from destroying our communities." Greg's case was still the poster child for juvenile crime. And because I had been prosecuting that, and my name had been in the papers quite a bit about prosecuting that and the problems of juvenile crime, the governor asked me to be his executive director to stop the punks and the thugs. Well, I knew that it was going to be an opportunity. And ironically, Greg's legacy gave me that opportunity to go try to make some sense of things, to stop this madness of thinking juvenile crime is only the Gregs out there. That was a 1 in a million case. That juvenile crime is about these kids that we all know that we're trying to help out of truancy, that we're trying to not have suspended from school, that do mistakes, but they can be rehabilitated. So I agreed to go over, and the first thing I thought, and I think it's a key for all of us, how do you change the perception of people thinking juvenile crime is the worst headlines you read about? We had one answer, and that was do our best to make our governor see what it's all about. And the best thing that ever happened was Governor Hunt went into a juvenile courtroom in Charlotte. He sat there for an hour and a half watching cases. And when he saw a case of a 14-year-old girl who was charged with undiscipline, being out of school, stealing a sweater because she was in foster care and she had no clothes to keep her warm, and the judge at that time sent her right to training school, the governor was appalled. And he said to me, "Where's her mama?" I said, "She doesn't have to be here. Our laws don't require a mother to be here." "Well, she's going to training school?" "Yes, sir." He couldn't believe it. And it took him to see the eyes of that child, the stories of these minor brushes with the law, the harsh consequences. We were on the cusp of getting tough on these punks and thugs. It became a balance. Because he had a commission of 26 people, and we didn't just meet in a conference room. Our governor drug everyone out to our detention center. Look at these kids, talk to these kids. Let's go to the Boys and Girls Clubs. Let's go to our training schools. Let's go to the wilderness camps. So for 6 months, all these state officials, led by our governor, went to look at the eyes and the faces and hear the stories of these kids. It changed the entire trajectory of juvenile law in North Carolina back in 1998. We had 1,400 kids in our training schools that year. This year, it's down to 400. We reduced it well over 75%, and we're proud of that. But it takes leadership. It takes putting a face of who we're talking about into the authorities and the leaders' minds and hearts. And unfortunately, our success has not continued because we have had different governors, one of whom never attended a state council meeting with juvenile justice, with education, with human services, with mental health. He stopped going. He would send in his deputy director. Well, what happens then? The people at the table drift away. If you didn't have that leadership, nothing happened. So we lost some of our momentum. But before we lost it all, there has been an effort for North Carolina not to be the state of shame in treating 16, 17-year-olds as adults. And we've worked 2 years with committees, legislative committees. Let's raise the age. Let's have this a moral issue of how we should treat minors in this state. And we were getting so much momentum in a final report, and then last November we had elections. And because it's not a partisan issue, but because Republicans came into control of both houses, everyone has just raised the white flag and raised their hand and said, that issue's going nowhere. And why is that? It boils down to, as so many things do with juvenile law, money, resources. It takes a lot more money to have these kids in our system getting the education, the mental health, the substance abuse, than it does to say 10 days in jail, $200 fine, $143 court costs. The revenue. But how are we going to raise this level to, once again, it's a moral issue. And if our politicians don't do it, maybe our courts should. Because we're losing too many kids day to day for minor offenses that get that collateral consequence, that indelible record stamped on them. Last night I couldn't come to the dinner you all had. I was at teen court. I volunteer for teen court, which are 16, 17-year-olds who would be adults for minor offenses. They do their own court. And it's always fascinating. And you know what cases I heard last night? A 17-year-old selling tobacco to a minor, charged with a criminal offense. And it comes into our district court, and if someone's not aware, we may miss that kind of offense, but we send her to teen court. Go to teen court. You do 15 hours of community service, you go to teen court sessions, you become the lawyer, you help other kids. But I'm presiding over this, and there are kids, and it's like, oh, teen court, you know, big deal. But you start talking to them. What's the consequence of this? This young girl, AB honor student, had a job, working. One kid comes in, she sells a pack of cigarettes, she didn't check his ID, and they nail her. She's fired from her job. She tried to apply to get another job. She had to answer the questions on the form. She didn't get a job. And the humiliation, she sits there in teen court, having tried to do all the right things. She said he looked like he was 20. That one time, that one mistake, what that will do to that child. And so we have to say, not only will teen court dismiss this, but you have to follow up and get it expunged, your arrest record. But you all heard the collateral consequences, our social networks, everything that goes on. Is it ever really erased? So there I go, diverting from my speech. But there's systemic consequences. It's not just the kids that receive the collateral consequences. It's also the system. It's us. It's people who are energized at first. You're a devoted juvenile justice professional. You may be a lawyer. You may be a judge. When I started out, I was a judge. One of the first years I was on the bench. We had a young boy that was told to me by mental health, Judge, we have a placement for him. It was Monday morning. Let's keep him in detention. By Friday, he's going to placement. Great. Sounds good. He needed that help. We kept him in detention. He had been a runner. He had a serious felony. He needed help. 2 weeks later, I saw the defense attorney in the hallway. Said, Judge Morey, did you hear what happened? Jesse tried to commit suicide in detention center yesterday. Jesse tried to commit suicide. He was supposed to have been placed 2 weeks ago. Oh no, the placement fell through. He was still sitting in detention. He couldn't take it one more day. They found him hanging in his room. Fortunately, got him in time, rushed him to the hospital. He was in critical condition. Who dropped the ball? I tell you, we had a show cause hearing. We had the detention center. We had mental health. We had the county manager. Everyone in that courtroom for a show cause. Why did this happen with this child? You know, we had a superintendent brought in. We don't have any power over changing kids in their school system, stopping suspensions, stopping transfers, but we can't put pressure on them. We've had our superintendent come into juvenile court, take the stand, and explain to us the suspension policy, explain to us why that parent wasn't given notice of the suspension, and after the fact, the time the appeal had expired, then was she told, oh, you could have appealed it, but time's expired. So you start out eager, you start out really wanting to change things, fight. But you know, we're human. Time wears you down. And you never want that to happen because these are the kids. These are only their lives. And you have to stay sharp. I'm guilty of it. Those cases take a lot out of you. And if you're wanting to be in this profession, you got to have a thick skin and you got to work hard. But I have watched attorneys in the courtroom begin to fight over motions rather than think of this child sitting here. It's not a case, it's this child. We had a case one day where a juvenile had been a passenger in the back seat of a car. The car had been stopped by police for a tail light that had been broken out. 4 kids in the car, all of them taken out of the car, all of them. Put your hands on the hood, spread your legs. 2 of them strip searched. All because the tail light was out in the car and he was a backseat passenger. They strip searched him. 15 rocks of crack cocaine had been taped in his butt. They got him. They charged him. We had a hearing. Judge, that's an illegal, unconstitutional violation of all his rights for that strip search based on that traffic stop. Absolutely. And the kid gets up, and the attorney shakes his hand, and he's walking out, but you're thinking, what is going to happen to him? Time for the next case. We don't have time to really address. What are the consequences? What are the collateral consequences? And I'm sitting there up as a judge watching him walk out, high-fiving a couple of his buddies, thinking, am I ever going to see him again? More importantly, will he ever see his 16th birthday again? Those are the kind of collateral consequences you think about. So it affects everyone. Every day when you're trying to work in what I think is one of the most important systems we could. We just had another case of a collateral consequence of burned out professionals. We had a social worker who brought a case of abuse, neglect, dependency in because a 2-year-old child's arm had been broken. There was evidence other broken bone injuries at different times had occurred. So they had this case in juvenile court. She was put on the witness stand. She was torn apart by the attorneys. The parent's attorney, the county attorney, guardian ad litem attorney. She was sliced and diced. What do you think the impact on her was? Well, about 6 months later, she had a report to go out and investigate another case. And it was a bad case of abuse. And she had been so beaten up in the courtroom, she didn't file a petition. She placed the child with another family member. Why? Not because it was the child's best interest. She was scared to death to walk in a courtroom. The blood sport of that courtroom horrified her. She wanted to be a social worker, but not at the expense of what happened. And by not filing a petition on that child was again abused by a family member 5 days later. That was a collateral consequence of systemic burnout in this very high-pressured system. So I wish I could be saying something funny at this point, you know? But it's heavy stuff. But it's stuff that if you have passion and compassion, there's no better work in the world. There's no more important work in the world, because who is a voice for these kids we are talking about except us? And I'm going to leave you with one final thought, that any of you see the Presidential Freedom Medal Awards President Obama just did this week? I was watching them the other night, and they were introducing, I think, former president, the first George Bush was honored. There was Warren Buffett was honored. But the amazing people that were honored with the highest award we can possibly get were people that, as children, had horrible adversity. Maya Angelou was honored. They said she was so abused as a child, she had lost her ability to speak. Here she is getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Bill Russell, 11-time NBA champion, had been cut from his junior high school basketball team and told he had no ability. Gerda Klein spent her childhood in a Nazi concentration camp and today leads a foundation for understanding. John Lewis, dirt poor, son of a sharecropper, now one of our most respected congressmen. And Sylvia Mendez, as a child denied entry to her elementary school, only to fight her cause through the Supreme Court, and now fights for children equality in our public schools. Each one of them had a life at the very beginning that had adversities we can't even imagine, and they overcame. So what's the point? Every one of our kids in our courtrooms, they can overcome. They can someday be the next Presidential Medal of Freedom winner. And we have to keep thinking about that. All of you are here for some reason. I don't know why you have an interest in juvenile justice, but there is a reason. Maybe it is your own life. Maybe it is someone you know. And we all approach juvenile justice looking back at our own childhoods. We all have a story about ourselves. And as Mother Teresa said, it's only with pride and selfishness and coldness that keeps us from having compassion. When we ultimately go home to God, we are going to be judged on what we were to each other, what we did for each other, and especially how much love we put in that. It is not how much we give, but how much love we put in the doing. I just say to you, put the love in the doing for juvenile justice. Thank you very much.